People tend to treat buying a wheel as the moment you become properly serious about sim racing. A controller is apparently something you use until you can afford the real thing, and then you are expected to become immediately faster, more consistent, and considerably more attractive when you're flexing your biceps. People see controllers as being inferior to a wheel due to a lack of precision and it being the same thing you play spin time with. While not generally comparable to racing games, the statement stands true objectively. But that doesn't tell the whole story. Controllers have a few tricks up their sleeves, or triggers, I should say. Anyways, a few people have taken it up to them to make controllers slightly more viable by using external scripts. One such script is called the Advanced Gamepad Assist for Assetto Corsa. Out of the box, Assetto Corsa is closer to an MS-DOS application than it is to a racing game, and expecting a good time with the controller is unreasonable. With the Advanced Gamepad Assist script, the game smooths out your steering and helps to deal with corrections that will normally require a lot more physical input on a wheel. Without a script, Assetto Corsa's standard controller steering is quite twitchy because the game is basically trying to translate a few millimeters of analog stick movement into the full steering range of a car, which is about as sensible as it sounds. Advanced Gamepad Assist is like Jesus taking the wheel between your thumb and the front wheels. It smooths the steering, adjusts how quickly the car turns as your speed changes, and limits the steering angle based on how much grip the tires can actually use. It also adds a self-steering effect that behaves a little like caster and the force feedback you would feel through a real wheel, helping the car straighten itself and counter-steer when the rear steps out. The result is not that it drives the car entirely for you, but it does a much better job of turning what you are trying to do with the stick into a sensible steering input, making racing, catching slides, and especially drifting far less awkward than Assetto Corsa's default controller handling. So, keeping all this in mind, I wanted to test a fairly simple question now that they're somewhat equal. Does a wheel actually make me faster, or does it just make the game feel better? To test that, I used 3 very different cars at 3 different tracks. The Ford GT3 Mark II at Brands Hatch, a BMW M4 GT3 at Road Atlanta, and a BMW M Hybrid V8 at Daytona. I will be comparing the fastest valid lap, average valid pace, how frequently I invalidated laps, and how easily I could correct mistakes, and how quickly I settled into a rhythm. This is not a perfectly isolated scientific comparison. I'm comparing the way I would realistically use both devices. This means the controller has Advanced Gamepad Assist enabled, while the wheel is fully unassisted. This also means I use a physical shifter and clutch on the wheel where the car supports them. Now for the test setup. For the controller, I used a PlayStation 5 DualSense controller with the Advanced Gamepad Assist script in its default settings. I used manual gears and clutch with no driving assist beyond the electronics available for each car. I drove using the chase cam. For the wheel, I used the standard Logitech G29 apart from a different shifter knob. I used the H-pattern shifter and clutch where applicable, including heel and toe downshifts on the GT40. I also used the cockpit camera here. The track was set to ideal conditions. Each car used the same setup between devices, which included traction control and brake bias settings. Fuel and tire consumption were disabled unless otherwise mentioned. I aimed for roughly 10 measured laps with each combination. I sometimes completed additional attempts when too many laps were invalid, but I will show the total number of attempts so that it does not disappear from the results. The GT40 was easily the hardest car out of the 3 to drive. It has plenty of power, relatively little grip, and none of the modern systems that usually stop a small mistake from becoming an expensive one. The controller was immediately faster here. My best controller lap was a 138.835 compared with a 140.002 on the wheel. This makes the controller just over 1.1 seconds faster rather than the 2 seconds I initially estimated. The 10 controller times averaged around a 140.495, while the 8 valid wheel laps averaged a 141.257. The main advantage came from the Gamepad Assist script. The GT40 constantly moves around beneath you, and you need to use small steering corrections while controlling the car's rotation with the pedals. The controller's grip smooths the steering out and reacts very quickly when the rear begins to step out. This made it much easier to remain near the limit without every small slide turning into a spin. It effectively removed a large part of the physical work involved in catching the car. This does not mean the controller was perfect. The small amount of travel on the analog stick made gentle steering adjustments difficult. Once I committed to an input, making a tiny correction halfway through the corner could easily become an overcorrection. The triggers created a similar problem under braking. I could apply heavy braking without much difficulty, but slowly releasing the brake or maintaining something like 5% pressure was much harder. There is very little physical travel and no meaningful resistance telling me exactly where I am in the input range. The DualSense adaptive triggers can theoretically help with this through third-party software, but the settings I tried never felt particularly natural. It simply may just require more experimentation. On a wheel, however, the GT40 becomes a completely different car. Instead of having the steering assistance manage most of the corrections, I had to react through the force feedback, turn the wheel quickly enough to make sure I did not create an even larger slide while trying to save the first one. The car required constant adjustment on entry, through the middle of the corner and again under power. If the rear stepped out too far, there was nobody quietly fixing it in the background. It was entirely dependent on my reaction time and how quickly I could rotate the wheel. The manual transmission added another layer. I was heel and toeing on downshifts. Because I have not driven many H-pattern cars recently, maintaining steady brake pressure while blipping the throttle was difficult. The Paddock Hill corner is the clearest example. You brake and begin turning as the track drops away, so you are simultaneously managing brake pressure, weight transfer and rotation. On controller, most of that movement felt fairly distant. On the wheel, I could feel the car moving around and had to actively balance it. This made the wheel much more engaging, but it also made mistakes considerably more punishing. Interestingly, the valid lap time variation was almost identical between both devices. The wheel was not dramatically less consistent once I completed a clean lap. The real difference was that a controller made it easier to access a faster lap time without the car punishing every small correction. This is a clear victory for the controller on short session pace. The wheel was far more informative and much more satisfying, but the controller assistance was extremely effective in a low grip car that needed constant counter steering. With considerably more wheel practice, I may eventually close the gap, but based on these sessions, however, the controller was comfortably faster. The M4 GT3 is much more predictable. It has ABS, traction control, a sequential gearbox, and significantly more grip. That removes a lot of the problems that made the GT40 so difficult. My fastest controller lap was a 119.842. 8 of the 10 attempts were valid, and the valid laps averaged a 120.388. The controller worked very well here. The M4's electronics reduced wheel spin and helped prevent the car being completely unstable, while the Gamepad script continued to smooth out the steering. I could push relatively hard without being especially worried that one small mistake would end the lap. My main weakness was long and gentle corners. The final corner at Road Atlanta was particularly awkward. Once I had committed to an analog stick position, correcting the line halfway through the corner was difficult. A small adjustment on a controller translates to a big input on the wheel. Braking was better than I expected. After some adaptation, I could get the car stopped reliably and modulate the trigger reasonably well. It still lacked the fine control of a pedal, but on GT3 cars, control over your braking can be worth several seconds. It might be the most limiting factor in extracting pace. The best wheel lap during the measured session was a 120.080, only 0.238 seconds behind the controller. 7 of the 11 laps were valid, and those valid laps averaged a 120.991. The wheel therefore had more invalid attempts and was around 6/10 slower on average. However, the valid wheel laps were actually grouped slightly more closely than the controller laps. The issue was that not every clean lap was wildly inconsistent. The issue was that I made more lap ending mistakes while trying to reach the same pace. Part of that came from the car itself. The M4 felt more nervous under braking than the Mustang GT3 I normally drive. I have around 4500 kilometers on the Mustang, so changing a car with a different braking balance took some adjustment. The wheel was noticeably better for trail braking. The pedal's longer travel made it much easier to gradually release the brake pressure and control how quickly the car rotated into a corner. It was also easier to make small mid-corner steering corrections. Instead of trying to find a very specific position within a few millimeters of the analog stick travel, I could slightly open or close the steering without disturbing the entire car. I know the wheel has more pace available because I have previously driven a 119.322 in practice with this combination. I also beat the controller time during a qualifying session in one of my league races. But it also needs to be said that the conditions were very different. My Mustang had some ballast and restrictor, and I run this lap with fuel and tire consumption on. These laps do not count as part of a control test, but they show the difference between immediate pace and eventual pace. The controller allowed me to reach a strong lap very quickly. The wheel took longer, but appears to have a higher ceiling once I'm properly adapted. The controller wins in a measured session, but only narrowly on the fastest lap. This is probably better described as a victory in time to pace rather than proof that the controller is inherently faster. It was easier to complete a respectable lap time immediately, while the wheel offered more precise braking and steering once I became comfortable. I need to preface that there was a slight inconsistency in the test. For the controller run, I accidentally left fuel and tire consumption enabled, but the wheel run was without tire and fuel consumption on. Just consider this when evaluating the results. The car started with 25 liters, and I would say that's around 3 or 4 tenths of lap time down. The tires really don't show that much effect until about 70% or below, which I never hit, though you will soon see that won't really affect our results. I used full hybrid deployment for the opening 2 laps before returning to the default medium setting. Everything else was set to the default option. My fastest valid controller lap was a 134.112. More importantly, only 4 of 15 attempts were valid. Most of the invalid laps came from running beyond the track limits at the exit of bus stop and turn 1. The valid laps themselves were fairly close together, averaging a 134.390. But that figure hides how difficult it was to complete one in the first place. Fast prototypes with a lot of downforce exposed the controller's limited steering resolution. In many corners, the car only needs a few degrees of steering, particularly at high speed. Finding and maintaining that exact input on an analog stick was extremely difficult. Turn 1 required me to brake while turning, meaning both the steering and the brake release had to be precise at the same time. I struggled consistently to get the front tires loaded without either missing the corner or asking too much from them. The banking created a different problem. Staying close to the yellow line required me to hold the stick at very specific position for a long time. There was very little margin between drifting up the banking and adding too much steering. I completed additional lap attempts because I wanted to know whether the problem would disappear after a few laps. It did improve, but I never reached a rhythm that felt natural. Now for the wheel. The wheel immediately suited the car better. My fastest lap was a 132.808, which was 1.304 seconds faster than the best valid controller lap. 8 of the 10 laps were valid, and the valid laps average a 133.422. Both of my first 2 wheel laps were already faster than the controller's best valid lap. The main advantage was precision. Turn 1 was easier because I could carefully combine the steering and braking rather than trying to locate both inputs within the small travel of the stick and trigger. The same applied through the bus stop. I could place the car more accurately on entry and make small corrections without going off track or spinning out. The banking may have been the largest difference. Holding the car near the yellow line was simple on the wheel because I could just maintain one stable steering angle. On controller, finding the exact input took much more concentration and left very little room for correction. There was more time available through the bus stop, but this was already the clearest wheel victory on the test. Even with an asterisk beside the test conditions, the wheel was comfortably faster, produced twice as many valid laps in fewer attempts and felt more natural. This is where the steering wheel's precision mattered more than the controller's assistance. Now for the conclusion. So, does a wheel actually make you faster in Assetto Corsa? Based purely on the measured fastest laps, the controller won on 2 tests and the wheel won on 1. The controller was 1.167 seconds faster in the GT40 and 0.238 seconds faster in the M4 GT3. The wheel won the last test by 1.304 seconds. But that score doesn't tell the entire story. The controller was extremely effective when the car moved around a lot. The advanced Gamepad assist dealt with slides and rapid corrections far more quickly than I could physically manage on the wheel. It allowed me to reach competitive pace with less practice. The wheel became much more valuable as the cars became faster and more dependent on precision. It gave me much finer control over steering, trail braking, and corner placement. It was harder to use immediately, but gave me more information and more room to improve. The M4 demonstrates this difference most clearly. The controller won on the short test, but my previous wheel lap showed that I can eventually go faster once I have enough time to adapt. So, my conclusion is not that one device is universally faster. The controller is easier to be fast with immediately, particularly when the steering assistance can manage the difficult corrections. The wheel is harder to master, but becomes increasingly useful when the car demands precise, repeatable inputs. Another thing that the wheel offers is immersion. You see, driving the GT40 with a controller versus a wheel is a whole different story. Ignoring the pace, the wheel felt way more fun to drive. I felt like I was desperately trying to tame 600 horsepower on nearly 50-year-old tires, and it shows. It's a proper spectacle to drive when there's nothing to hold your hand. It brings out the character in cars in a more nuanced manner that the controller simply cannot achieve. I think that alone makes it a different case for comparing the wheel versus a controller. Sure, at best, they both may be roughly equal in pace, but the wheel is just more immersive and fun. It teaches you more real-life skills that you may just not be able to learn with the controller. And now, to answer the original question, a wheel can make you faster, and it definitely does not do it immediately. It does, however, make cars like the GT40 considerably more frightening, which is probably worth the price by itself. But if you can't afford a wheel or do not have the space for it, just keep in mind that a controller these days is closing the gap to wheels. Prior to this Gamepad script, driving in Assetto Corsa was essentially impossible to do consistently. But that doesn't mean that a wheel is obsolete. They both have their strengths. It just so happens that a wheel is harder to master, but the fruit is well worth it.